All right, well, good afternoon. I'm Stephen Ezel. I'm the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for the release of ITIF's new report on the vital importance of the Bayh-Dole Act to America's life sciences innovation system. Life sciences innovation seems to be the topic of the day on Capitol Hill, so we're excited that you've chosen to join the RIGHT conference this afternoon. And before we begin, I want to thank Representative Delbini from Washington for securing the venue for us. She wasn't able to be here to speak with us this afternoon, but Representative Doug Collins of Georgia will join us at 1 o'clock to provide some comments. So what I'll do is introduce our panelists. Then I and they will present. We'll have a moderated panel Q&A session up until 1 o'clock when Representative Collins arrives. He'll speak, take some questions, and then we'll turn it over for questions from the audience. We're joined by an esteemed panel today. After my presentation, we'll first hear from Mr. Joseph P. Allen, who was the president of Allen and Associates. Joe served on the Senate Judiciary Committee for Senator Birch Bayh and played a key role in securing passage of the Bayh-Dole Act. After his time on the Hill, Joe went on to serve in the Department of Commerce, where he was the director of the Office of Technology Commercialization. Joe has continued to be active globally in technology transfer policy issues. He's consulted to the World Bank, and he's helped other countries like South Africa and Kazakhstan put in place similar Bayh-Dole-like technology transfer laws. After Joe's presentation, we'll hear from Mr. Steve Sisolka. Steve is the CEO of Autumn, a nonprofit organization whose goal is to advance technology transfer worldwide. Prior to joining Autumn, Steve served as the Associate Director for Commercialization at Wake Forest Innovations, where he is responsible for commercializing high-impact inventions and drafting, negotiating, and executing a wide variety of licensing and startup transactions. He's a registered U.S. patent agent and a past board of the Wake Forest Affiliated Startup Alliance. Steve holds a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Virginia. Lastly, among the panelists, Melissa Brand, who is the Associate Counsel and Director for Intellectual Property at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO. In that role, Melissa advocates domestic and international intellectual property matters, focusing on patent law and privacy. Before joining BIO, Melissa worked as a patent litigator at Latham & Watkins and Wilson Sonsini Goodrich. She also served as a law clerk for Kimberly Moore on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. All right, well, with that, let me provide some remarks to frame our conversation today and introduce our report. ITIF is the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, nonprofit, nonpartisan. We're a think tank focused on advocating for public policies that drive innovation-based economic growth in the United States, in our states, and in countries around the world. We were named by the University of Pennsylvania Global Go-To Think Tank Index this past January as the world's leading science and technology policy think tank. So the reality is that today, America leads the world in life sciences innovation. In fact, in the decade of the 2000s, US headquartered companies produced more new chemical entities, more new drugs, than companies from the next 5 nations combined. By some estimates, the United States has been responsible for as much as 70% of global biomedical investment over the past 2 decades. And well, since 1997, the US consistently leads the world in the number of new chemical or new biological entities brought to market. While we lead today, however, the reality is that US leadership in life sciences innovation was not always the case. In fact, for the vast majority of the post-World War II era, the United States was a global also-ran in life sciences innovation. If you look at the last 5 years of the 1970s, US headquartered, or essentially the last 5 years of the 1970s, European headquartered life sciences companies produced more than twice as many new to the world drugs as did American ones, 149 to 66. And as this chart shows, well into the 1980s, less than 10% of new drugs introduced first to global marketplaces were introduced in the United States. The United States simply was not an attractive environment for the conduct of life sciences research and development, nor an attractive environment to introduce new drugs to the world. However, as the orange line shows, by the mid-2010s, we had flipped the script. And by 2014, 60% of new drugs introduced first in the world were introduced first in the United States. The fact that America now leads in life sciences innovation is not an accident. Rather, it has been the result of a series of intentional and conscientious public policy choices stretching back to the 1980s that were specifically designed to make America the world's preeminent location for the conduct of life sciences research and for bringing new drugs to market. A number of policies have played a key role. First, robust public and private investment in biomedical research, $40 billion a year for the NIH for public scientific life sciences research funding, complemented by about $100 billion now a year in private sector life sciences research. America's life sciences industry is the most R&D intensive sector of any in the United States, reinvesting about 20% of its profits annually in further research. Strong incentives to encourage investment, such as the R&D tax credit implemented in 1981 or the orphan drug tax credit. An effective regulatory and drug approval system keyed by PDUFA, or the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. In fact, in 1987, it took the FDA 29 months, almost 2.5 years, to make a determination regarding the safety and efficacy of a new drug. Today, that's under 10 months. An effective pricing and reimbursement system that allows innovators to earn sufficient revenues to support research. For the reality is there is a direct 0.97 correlation as found by the OECD in the ability of life sciences companies to earn profits and then to reinvest in research. And finally, a robust intellectual property rights and protection system, including the Bayh-Dole Act. So what was the Bayh-Dole Act? Bipartisan legislation passed in 1980 that gives universities, small businesses, nonprofit institutions, and other contracting organizations rights to intellectual property generated from federal funding. What drove Congress to enact the Bayh-Dole Act? The reality is that in the 1970s, with economic malaise and stagnation, US competitiveness was faltering. The Bayh-Dole Act was envisioned along with the 1981 R&D tax credit, the 1982 Stevenson-Wilder Act, as a set of policies designed to turbocharge innovation and technology transfer in the United States. But a key motivating factor was that there was a massive lack of commercialization of federally funded research. In 1978, the government licensed less than 5% of the 28,000 patents it owned. And previous to that, in 1968, when President Johnson had famously asked then Comptroller General Elmer Statz to go in and look at how many new drugs have been brought to market in the 50s and 60s as a result of federally funded research, Statz simply couldn't find a single one. Federally funded technology inventions simply were not getting expression to the marketplace. The Bayh-Dole Act's impact was immediate and profound. It led to a tenfold increase in academic patenting in its first 20 years, and since its enactment in 1980, over 80,000 patents and 12,000 startup companies have resulted from academic technology transfer. Further, over 200 drugs and devices have been developed through public-private partnerships facilitated by the Bayh-Dole Act. No less than The Economist has called the Bayh-Dole Act possibly the most inspired piece of legislation to be enacted in America over the past half-century. It unlocked all the inventions and discoveries that have been made in laboratories throughout the United States with the help of taxpayers' money. More than anything, this single policy measure helped to reverse America's precipitous slide into industrial irrelevance. And as Steve will talk about the strength of academic patenting, the strength of US universities, this was also a result of the Bayh-Dole Act. As Harvard University's Naomi Hausman has written, The sort of large-scale technology transfer from American universities that exists today would have been very difficult and likely impossible to achieve without the strengthened intellectual property rights standardized across granting agencies that were set into law in 1980 thanks to the Bayh-Dole Act. The success of the act is also reflected in the fact that it has been emulated by about 24 countries from throughout the world, economic competitors like China, peers like Germany, Japan, Korea, the United Kingdom, developing countries like Mexico, Brazil, Chile, and South Africa. These countries have implemented Bayh-Dole Act legislation because they recognize that the Bayh-Dole Act works. The report spends a fair amount of time attempting to document the complementary roles played by key actors in America's life sciences innovation system and how the Bayh-Dole Act facilitates the transmission of technology from government to university to the private sector. I'll ask Steve to say more about that, but just want to emphasize the federal government really plays a vital role in funding for basic scientific research that is designed to identify the underlying mechanisms of diseases and find promising points of intervention. Much of that federally funded R&D occurs at US universities. In fact, 56.5% of all university R&D in the US is oriented towards the life sciences, and that results in about $38 billion of life sciences R&D conducted annually with funders from the federal government to businesses to universities themselves. And then it's the private sector that picks up the technologies and the inventions coming out of US universities and engages in the lengthy, difficult, risky, and expensive process of commercialization and bringing basic discoveries to market. As you know, this process can take 12 to 14 years at a cost of as much as $2.6 billion to bring a new drug to market. And research shows, again, the complementarity. There's about $100 of private investment for every $1 of public investment in a new drug. We need all actors working together to sustain this effective American life sciences innovation system. The report walks through 4 in-depth case studies of the Bayh-Dole in action. It looks at Yervoy, which was a treatment for metastatic melanoma skin cancer, looks at Luxturna, which was the first FDA-approved therapy for inherited blindness, a gene therapy for inherited blindness, looks at Gleevec for leukemia. And I thought this was an interesting case study. I'll just go over briefly. This is of a company called CardioMEMS, which makes implanted pulmonary artery monitoring devices. Essentially, the quick story on CardioMEMS goes back to the mid-1990s when Georgia Tech professor Mark Allen received a $500,000 research grant from the Armour Research Laboratory to develop sensors that would work in extreme environments like jet turbines. So Mr. Allen does the research, publishes in scientific journals, Georgia Tech gets a patent, the military deploys his sensors in their engines. And then in the 2000s, he starts to work with a colleague at Georgia Tech thinking about how they could adapt these sensors to another extreme operating environment, the human heart. So they get a technology license for the patent from Georgia Tech, and in 2001, they incorporate CardioMEMS. They attract $50 million in venture capital. Notice the 100-to-1 correlation again, $100 of commercialization activity for the $1 that went in, the $500,000. So they go through the process, and in 2005, the FDA approves the PAP system for the tens of thousands of Americans who now have one of those devices implanted in their pulmonary artery. They've experienced a 37% reduction in heart failure hospitalizations. CardioMEMS has grown to be a company of over 700 employees, recently bought by Abbott. But it's a great story of a company that got its start in federally funded research, technology licensed by a university to an innovator, spun out to the market, and we have another example of why America leads the world in life sciences innovation. Now, the architects of the Bayh-Dole Act did include a set of march-in rights that they intended to apply only in very specific and very extreme cases. March-in rights refers to the ability of the federal government, under certain circumstances, to march in and require patent holders to grant exclusive, non-exclusive, or partially exclusive licenses to third parties in very certain and specific conditions. as CRS writes, these 4 conditions are: if the contractor fails to take effective steps to achieve practical application of the subject invention, if the product can't be substantially manufactured in the United States, if the contractor cannot meet requirements for public use as specified by federal regulations, or if action is needed to alleviate health or safety needs which are not reasonably satisfied by the patent holder. You will note that none of these 4 cases in which the government can march in refers to reasonable pricing. And as the architects of the Bayh-Dole Act, Senator Birchby and Bayh-Dole, point out, that is intentional. As they wrote in an op-ed for the Washington Post, quote, Bayh-Dole did not intend that government set prices on resulting products. The law makes no reference to a reasonable price that should be dictated by the government. And this is the case because the architects of the Bayh-Dole Act primarily included march-in rights so that they could ensure that commercialization activity ensued, or to address conditions of extreme national emergency where for some reason a drug could not be manufactured in the United States. There have been 6 petitions at the NIH asking the government to step in to exercise march-in rights. Despite this, march-in rights have not been used during the 39-year history of the Drug Act, of the Bayh-Dole Act. And with regard to the 4 cases where petitioners have asked the NIH to march in due to the price of the drug, the NIH has consistently responded by saying, quote, the extraordinary remedy of march-in rights is not an appropriate means of controlling prices. And that analysis was recently reinforced by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which in its Return on Investment Initiative Green Book wrote, quote, that the government would seek to implement regulatory change under the Bayh-Dole Act by specifying that march-in rights should not be used to control or regulate the price of resulting goods and services. Now, we do have one natural experiment from the past when the government has tried to implement price controls. In 1987, the NIH began to implement CRADAs, or Cooperative Research and Development Agreements, because the NIH recognized they had the potential to significantly advance biomedical research by allowing the exchange and use of experimental compounds, proprietary research materials between the private sector and the government. So we put in place the CRADAs for NIH in 1987, but then in the year 1990, NIH begins to impose reasonable price requirements on drugs that result from the resulting CRADAs. And as this chart shows you, between 1990 and 1995, there was a decrease in the activity of the CRADAs, of the collaborations between the public and private sector. And ultimately, in 1995, the NIH repealed the reasonable pricing requirement. And as then NIH Director Harold Varmus explained, an extensive review of this matter over the past year indicated that the pricing clause has driven away industry from potentially beneficial scientific collaborations with scientists without providing an offsetting benefit to the public. Eliminating the clause will promote research that can enhance the health of the American people. So we have a natural experiment from history showing that applying reasonable pricing clauses to these licensing agreements results in less, not more, innovation. So in conclusion, from the ITIF perspective, American leadership in life sciences innovation is the result of conscientious policy choices that need to be sustained. The Bayh-Dole Act is working effectively and as intended, enabling valuable financial support for America's research universities. The Bayh-Dole Act provides certainty in conveying the ownership of intellectual property rights. And finally, the application of march-in rights to control drug prices is simply not the intent of the law and would threaten to significantly undermine the strength of America's life sciences innovation system. If a government ever had the capacity to march in decades later and compulsory license the intellectual property underpinning a new drug on the grounds that some of it might have been in part contributed by federal research, and now the price of that drug is unreasonable, whatever that means, it would seriously undermine the mechanics of America's life sciences innovation system and give companies considerable pause about investing the hundreds of millions, if not billions, that's required to bring a new drug to market. Thank you. That's ITIF's perspective, but I think it's important to hear from somebody who was there from the beginning when Congress enacted the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980. So let me now turn the floor over to Joe Allen. Thank you, Joe.
So I have to include this picture, first of all, to show people that I wasn't born with white hair. Secondly, to warn all you young people, this is what you can look like if you get into tech transfer. So it's not a profession for the weak of heart. What I'd like to do is, Stephen did a really nice job on laying the groundwork about the Bayh-Dole Act. I don't want to repeat that, but I would like to just go through why did we pass the Bayh-Dole Act, what was it intended to do, and just some of the implications of it. I stumbled into this. I was a junior staffer, and Senator Bayh's chief counsel asked me to sit in on a meeting, mainly because no one knew what Purdue wanted to talk about for patent rights. But what we found out was the government, after World War II, basically had a Marshall Plan of technology. If you've heard of the Marshall Plan, we were helping to rebuild Europe. We also had a policy going back to World War II that if the government funded any research, even a small percentage, any inventions would be taken away from the creator and put in the public domain. We thought that was really going to help spur technology. And for the 40s and 50s and a lot of the 60s, it probably didn't make much of a difference because we didn't really have any international competition. But the Japanese and other people started realizing pretty quickly that we had some really good research there. We were giving it away. And suddenly, when I was on Senator Bayh's staff, we found out we were losing the steel industry, which was in Indiana. We lost automobiles, we lost electronics. We were up for re-election, and a lot of people were saying, why are we putting billions of dollars into federal research and nothing comes out? If you have an EKG like the bottom line, you're not going to come out very well. So what we found was billions of dollars are going into this, and as Stephen said, we had the Comptroller General testify that when the government took away patent rights, not a single drug had ever been developed. Actually, Lyndon Johnson did that study. If you know anything about Lyndon Johnson, he didn't suffer fools lightly. I would not want to be the staffer that had to go in and say, Mr. President, we haven't found any drugs being commercialized. So what we realized was that that wasn't working. For also those of you on the Hill, we certainly fought. Senator Bayh's a liberal Democrat. Bob Dole was a conservative Republican. We certainly fought with each other. But there actually was a time on Capitol Hill, believe it or not, when actually we would work together when a crisis like this hit. And the fact that Bayh and Dole from both different spectrums introduced a bill to change this made a huge impact. So what did Bayh-Dole do? Well, basically, Bayh-Dole is Jeffersonian. The idea of Bayh-Dole was have the government fund the research, which again, basic research is something the government needs to fund because industry's not going to do it. It's too long-term, it's too high risk. Set a few rules and then get out of the way. Provide incentives and then let the people making the inventions actually see if they have commercial value or not. So that's what Bayh-Dole does. The other thing I should tell you is Stephen did a really nice job on the impact of Bayh-Dole. You have to remember, when we did this back in 1979, very few universities had any capability of technology transfer. We didn't have a single company testify in Judiciary Committee that they wanted to work with universities. Not a single one. Now you see what's happening now. But when we did this in 1979, 1980, it was really a crapshoot, but we knew whatever we did had to be better than what was happening before. Again, I don't want to roll through all the things. Stephen has actually done that. But one thing that we did have to say, and I'm unapologetic about this, the purpose of Bayh-Dole is that the government owes it to the American taxpayer to give them a return on investment. And I'm not apologetic at all that Bayh-Dole says we want to give a preference for small companies and also for those who will make products substantially in the United States. Doesn't mean you can't license people that will make them abroad, but the preference has to be making them here because we want to have the jobs and the economic benefits actually work to the American taxpayers' benefit. Okay, so we passed Bayh-Dole. Senator Bayh lost. I'm out of work. Actually, I'll never forget, I was watching the 1980 elections. At that time, we had 3 networks. I'm sitting with my son, Zach, who's 5 years old. My wife and I are going to a Democratic victory party, which is highly ironic. So I'm watching the returns come in, and the first return is Indiana has gone to Reagan, and Birch Bayh's lost. Well, that's my boss. And my son looked at me with his 5-year-old eyes and said, Dad, does that mean I don't get an allowance anymore? And he was pretty damn close to right. But what happened after Bayh-Dole passed? Well, the bureaucracy spent 2 years trying to undermine the Bayh-Dole regulations because we were decentralizing power from Washington to the universities. So we had 2 years of them actually trying, just because you pass a law doesn't mean it's going to be implemented. The only reason you have Bayh-Dole was President Reagan came in, and the Department of Commerce was the oversight office. I ran that later. And Reagan actually looked at it and said, no, I'm going to endorse Bayh-Dole as a policy. We're going to decentralize this. So that's the reason you have the Bayh-Dole Act. If the regulations had gone haywire, you would have had government micromanagement despite what the Congress had tried to do. The two other things that happened was Bayh-Dole is based on a strong, dependable patent system. In the 1980s, very much like now, there was a lot of lack of confidence in the patent system. So in 1982, we passed a thing called the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which actually stabilized patent law. The other thing happened is the Supreme Court ruled that biotechnology patents were in fact protectable. So what happened? When biotech was first made, mainly with federal funding, the big pharmaceutical companies didn't commercialize biotech. It was too risky. What happened with the American biotech industry? Small startup companies were spun out. Most of them failed. But if you look at the US biotech industry now, it's characterized by small companies around university research. That's exactly how we started taking our lead in life sciences. Okay, I'm sorry, this is kind of small for you to read. Under the Bayh-Dole Act, we did not pass Bayh-Dole to enrich universities. Universities are stewards of the public interest. Stewardship is a biblical concept. It means treating other people's property even better than you treat yourselves. We actually had in the original Bayh-Dole Act a thing called recoupment, because people said, well, what if somebody makes a blockbuster invention of the government funding? And we actually had a provision in Bayh-Dole that the government would get a percentage of royalties back to the government to fund more research. The agencies came to us and said, look, we don't want to fool with the paperwork having to track all these inventions. So the ROI for Bayh-Dole is new technologies commercialized and also contributions to the economy. Steve went through a lot of the numbers here. I should add that the 283 new drugs and vaccines is from a pending study. That's actually tracking those from university patenting. So I can't say all of them were federally funded. It's a pretty good bet most of them were, but I want to add that caveat because I've actually talked to the authors. But we had none before. So let's suppose it was 200. You had 0 before Bayh-Dole, you have 200 now. That's a pretty good increase. The other thing is every day of the year, Yom Kippur, Christmas, Halloween, whatever day it is, on the average, the U.S. commercializes 2 new products and starts 2 new companies around university technology. We are the only country in the world even close to that. As Stephen mentioned, I actually did some consulting in Kazakhstan, which was interesting. I really advise you, if you're going to go to Kazakhstan, don't go in December. But people around the world are looking for how do we integrate government-funded research into the economy. The South Africans, the African National Congress in South Africa said, we've got to actually we can't just keep going with our hands out. We need to be developing our own technologies. And they did a worldwide search, credentialed Bayh-Dole as the world best practice, actually had me come over and testify, which I didn't know when they invited me, to the African Parliament. And the ANC has actually adopted a Bayh-Dole Act in South Africa. So again, it's made a huge contribution to the economy, but the biggest impact to me is on human lives. We had the 30th anniversary of Bayh-Dole. We had Jim Greenwood speak from Bio. We had the patent commissioner speak, the patent director. We had Senator Bayh speak. All I can remember from that is the last person speaking was Betsy DePerry. And she came up to the podium, turned around, hugged Birch Bayh, and said, but for your law, I would not be alive today. Excuse me. That's why we did Bayh-Dole. Okay, so I'm at the Department of Commerce. I'm running the oversight office. We have a new assistant secretary. And she says, well, what's this whole tech transfer thing about? So I had John Preston from MIT come down, who ran their office. He did a really nice presentation. And so he ended with this. You can have all the laws in place, but this is the bottom line. I don't usually read PowerPoints, but I'm going to read this one. Passion is the most important ingredient for successful commercialization. The inventor, management, and the partnering company all must share the passion for success. If any party does not, the deal will fail. You can write that on the wall. You can take it to the bank. Then he added this. What kills passion? Greed, destructive criticism, lawyers and committees, bureaucracy, and red tape. God love my assistant secretary. As soon as John left, she took that PowerPoint, put it on her wall outside our office door, because we had a lawyer we called Dr. No, who no matter what we tried to do, his immediate answer was no. Well, anytime he came to her office, he saw this. And so the reason Bayh-Dole works is it has government oversight, but it's minimal because you can't micromanage innovation. And let me just close with this. If we were having a meeting in 1978, up on Capitol Hill, and we're looking at what's the future of the software industry, you know who would have been at the table? A bunch of people from IBM, men from IBM, not women from IBM, with blue suits on, white shirts, and red ties. These clowns wouldn't have gotten through security. How many of you would have put your money in behind these people in 1978? And if you did,
I was trying to figure out why you had Korean School out of revival.
yeah. How many, now if you had invested in these people in 1978, you'd be a very wealthy person right now. But what I want to close with is, universities are funding early stage research. Kathy Koo, who ran Stanford University's Tech Transfer Office, did a great talk. She talked about the 3 biggest deals Stanford ever did. One was Google. When Google walked in, a bunch of kids from the dorm who actually made a search engine with National Science Foundation funding, no one was interested in licensing it. There already were search engines when they invented this. Stanford didn't even take a royalty. They just took an equity in Google. When innovation walks in the door, it looks like this. No one recognizes it, and that's what people need to understand. They always look at the big blockbuster and say, oh my God, anybody could have done that. The government just gave it away. No, it looks like this. The other point I want to make, and I'm going to stop at this, is, and this is always missed, the people taking the risk in our system is not the government, it's not universities, it's industry. The odds are any technology that you pick out of federal funding is going to fail. If you're commercializing a new drug, 10 years, $800 to $3.2 billion, and about 95% chance of failure. If that drug goes down, people don't lose their jobs at the university. They don't lose their jobs at NIH. But you know what happens if you have a venture fund, or if you have a startup when you basically have the mortgage built on based on your company? That's who takes the fall. And if there's one thing I want to get through of, is Bayh-Dole is not a giveaway. Companies are taking the risk, and the reason it works is we've set up a Jeffersonian system with incentives there for the companies, the government, and the university all to benefit, including the inventors. It's a very fragile system, and if you start monkeying around with it, we can go right back to where we were before. So I want to close with that. I appreciate the time to be here. And again, thanks for coming. And if nothing else, you got a free lunch.
Great, thank you, Joe. Steve.
Great. Excellent. All right, so we've heard a fantastic history of the implementation of the Bayh-Dole Act and its effect by both Stephen and Joe. What I want to provide is the university, hospital, research institute, and government lab perspective on how that's changed technology transfer. So as Stephen mentioned, my name is Steve Susalka. I'm the CEO of Autumn. Autumn is a nonprofit association focused on empowering, promoting, and connecting the next generation of technology transfer professionals that are focused on making the world a better place through commercializing, through commercializing the next generation of academic and nonprofit inventions. So as you've heard before, and I want to amplify this, and I'm going to amplify a couple of other points that were made, it is not an understatement to say that the Bayh-Dole Act catalyzed academic tech transfer to a level never before seen and now being emulated across the globe. We have a very simple mission in Autumn and our 3,000 members, and that is, it's a simple mission, but it is has a profound effect on society, and that is to support and advance technology transfer globally. So you may be familiar with technology transfer, that phrase, or you may not be. However, I can guarantee you that every person in this room and your loved ones has been affected by technology transfer. Let me give you a couple of examples. Any of you that might be affected by seasonal allergies, you can thank hometown hero Georgetown University for developing the initial compound that turned into Allegra. For those of you that have kids that hate getting shots like mine, yet you want to administer the flu vaccine, then you can thank St. Louis School of Medicine and the University of Michigan for providing Flu Mist. Those of you that might know someone who's trying to quit smoking or has used the nicotine patch to get rid of their nicotine cravings, again, you could thank UCLA. All of these are examples, and these are just some of the hundreds of examples of university technologies that have been commercialized. So first, initially developed at a university, and then through the process of technology transfer, commercialized by partnering companies to advance those technologies further. So how did that all happen? right? So you have all these great technologies. How did that actually occur? So why don't we quickly walk through the process? And it really starts, as you can imagine, with research. And this is one of the greatest parts of Bayh-Dole. Bayh-Dole recognized that the vanguard of research really came from US universities, hospitals, research labs, government labs. So Autumn has been holding a licensing activity survey for over 25 years. So we've got some great historical data on the development of the field over that period of time. And in our latest licensing activity survey, we've shown that about $68 billion has been invested in research at these universities and hospitals and government labs. So that's great. Why does that matter to you? Well, one, you want Allegra. But number two, come April 15th, or perhaps some of you that are go-getters have done it already, you're going to file your own taxes. You're going to file taxes, and you're going to be paying some taxes to the federal government. Well, of this $68 billion, about 58% of that comes from actual federal funds. That's money that we invest in our taxes that is going back to those academic institutions. We talked about universities being the stewards of that tax-paying funds and the inventions that arise from that. So you have a vested interest in this. Not only do you want the products, but you've actually helped to invest that money. All right, so you've got research. We have plowed significant revenue into research at these different institutions. What does that lead to? Well, that leads to inventions. Now, that shouldn't come as a surprise, right? So the more research, the more inventions you're going to get. It turns out in, again, our latest survey, we found almost 25,000 inventions were developed in US universities, hospitals, government labs in 2017 alone. Almost 25,000. Any of those could be the next cancer therapeutic, the next artificial intelligence technology, next photovoltaic. So that is wonderful beginnings of the next products. So some of those products I showed before. Now, it is not a very simple step to go from academic research with highly trained researchers that are focused on a particular area of interest into an actual commercializable produced product, right? So universities are spectacular at developing the research. They need that commercial piece to move that invention to the marketplace. Again, the bench to the bedside. Now, I mentioned that research leads to inventions, and you probably think about it and you say, well, yeah, it's probably, somewhat aligned. The more research, the more inventions. Well, it turns out it is really aligned. To the point that you could see it's almost a linear relationship. And in fact, when you look at historical data, there's actually a number for it. And that's $2.7 million on average equals one invention. So what does that tell you? The more research you have, the more inventions you have. And now the important step, though, is the next part. And that is, again, those inventions are developed at a university. And that's where the Technology Transfer Office is involved. Technology Transfer Office does a number of things. They evaluate the invention, determine whether it's protectable and there's a market for it. They also are responsible for protecting that intellectual property with either patents, copyrights, trademarks, other types of intellectual property protection. But then most importantly, they are responsible for identifying that commercial partner that'll bring that product to market. And so if there are two parts I want to get across right here, it's this. The first one is, at the end of the day, and you all know this, but I'm just going to emphasize this, at the end of the day, a university does not sell a product. Does not sell a product. Georgetown never sold Allegra. So instead, they need to identify a partner, a commercial partner like a Sanofi or another company that's willing to take that nascent invention, and they are nascent. These are not clinical trial, phase 3 clinical trial data. This is early stage inventions, and bring that to market. They need to partner with that company. So that's the first thing I want to tell you. Universities do not create products. Number two, there is a license agreement between the university and the company that determines that relationship. And the important point I want to mention here is that license agreement is around the intellectual property that's being transferred. That intellectual property is generally in the form of patent rights, generally. So The second point I want to make is strong, defendable, and predictable patent rights are absolutely critical to getting that invention, early stage invention from a university, hospital, government lab, research institute, into the hands of a company willing to develop the 100 times investment in bringing that product to market. So I want to make sure I amplify that. So again, going back to our licensing data, so how did that actually work out? Well, again, you see $68 billion in research led to about 25,000 inventions. Well, in 2017 alone, we reported over 7,800 license agreements. Now, these agreements cover all different types of intellectual property, from cancer therapeutics to new engineering to software, the whole gamut there. But each one of these license and option agreements could be that next cure for cancer, that next polymer that's going to change the way you live. It could be the next Honeycrisp apple that you might have had for lunch yesterday. So what I wanted to emphasize here is universities, through their research funding, develop the next stage of inventions, and then it's critical for them to protect those inventions with strong, predictable patent rights to then license those to companies who will invest the time, energy, and money into developing that into the next Flu Mist, Allegra, or nicotine patch. So I want to leave you with a couple of final thoughts. So the first is tech transfer is inextricably linked to federal research support. And I mentioned that before. So you saw that research support and inventions lined up absolutely on top of each other. Federal research funding is critical for that. Now, over the course of the 25 years we've been looking at, that research funding that came from federal grants has steadily declined. And so it went from close to 60 or 70% down to now we're below 59%, or at about 58%. So that means where else is that research funding coming from? Industry is providing a portion of it. Universities are funding their own research, and there are foundations and other agencies as well that are supporting that. Okay, so tech transfer linked to federal research support. Second thing, and I mentioned this before, but I want to emphasize this, it is absolutely reliant on that strong and predictable patent protection. In the absence of that, and I really want to underline this, in the absence of strong intellectual property protection, those technologies that are developed by universities are going to wither on the vine. They are just not going to be advanced if a company does not find the interest in advancing that technology further. Those technologies, of which there are thousands, will just wither, and nothing will happen. And that's the last thing we want. As taxpayers, as husbands and brothers and fathers, we want to actually use the results of our tax-paying dollars and the inventions developed to create a better world. All right. And then I want to give you just a couple of quick numbers here, and that is when you think about it, you think about these products. Turns out 755 different products came out in 2017 alone out of university research. Your tax-paying dollars at work, 755 new technologies. Turns out it is also a tremendous economic development driver. In fact, over 1,000 startup companies were started in 2017 alone. Stephen mentioned CardioMEMS as one example, and of course that was pre-2017. 2017 alone, 1,080 startup companies arose out of university, hospital, and government lab research. Now, what's really interesting about that is, of course, that provides a larger tax base, that provides employment opportunities for your community. But most interestingly to me is the fact that the majority of those companies that are developed out of university research are headquartered in that state. Not a surprise, but it allows that local governmental support to actually be amplified through economic development. As Joe mentioned in one of his previous slides, we've seen through studies done with bio, it has been an economic driver of both GDP and jobs. Up to 4.2 million jobs have been developed thanks to nonprofit sector licensing over the last 20 years. So, technology transfer is absolutely responsible for those innovative products for tomorrow. And Bayh-Dole has played an absolutely pivotal role in the unleashing of that American innovation. To continue our dominance, we've got to do three things. One, we've got to keep investments strong, right? Investments lead to more inventions lead to more products. Second thing is, we have to continue to strengthen our patent rights. In the absence of strong patent rights, those inventions are going to wither on the vine. And then finally, we've got to protect the core of what got us here in the first place, and that's the Bayh-Dole Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Melissa.
All right. Well, I'm not sure I'm the one who should be batting cleanup in this lineup, but I'll do my best. And today I hope to give you a perspective from industry and maybe some practical illustration of the systems in which we are working. Again, I'm Melissa Brand from BIO. BIO is a trade organization representing biotechnology entities. So we are made up of more than 1,000 members. We have biotech companies, academic institutions, state research centers, and related organizations, and we span the for-profit and nonprofit worlds. But one of the things I want to focus on today is the fact that about 90% of our corporate members are small companies, small to mid-sized companies. So these entities have less than $25 million in revenue per year. But despite their size, they're incredibly important. About 70% of the drug development pipeline is held by these small companies. And we know that these small companies are, especially the ones in the US, putting out more molecules that are intended for FDA approval than any other entities. So the first thing I'd like to show up here is what we call the biopharma ecosystem. So we've heard a lot today about the different roles, especially federal funding, universities, and industry. But I just wanted to put this up here to sort of give an illustration of all of the players that are involved in the ecosystem. So we have the funders at the top. I know venture capital was mentioned earlier with respect to BioMEMS as a good example. And we have the companies and the universities, the government who plays a large role in facilitating the actual delivery of the drugs to patients who are ultimately who we are all working to serve. So I'm going to focus mostly on the three entities that are shown in light blue, so universities and institutions, small companies and large companies. And the reason I want to focus on those three entities is because those are the ones doing the heavy lifting in actually researching and developing the cures and medicines we have today and the ones that we are trying to bring forward for the future. We've heard a little bit about what those roles are, and I want to just touch on it in a little bit more detail. So traditionally, we think of universities and research institutions focusing on what is called basic research. And that has been defined as fundamental, theoretical, or experimental investigative research without a specifically envisioned or immediately practical application. So you can think of this as perhaps studying the biology of a disease, identifying a protein or receptor that might become the ultimate drug target. And then you move into what we call applied research, which is predominantly thought of as being handled in the industry or private sector. So this can include things like medicinal chemistry, process chemistry and formulation, drug metabolism, pharmacokinetics, and safety sciences. So this is what we traditionally think of, though a lot of times, it's not so clear in public discussion who exactly is doing what. So then the next slide, I have some research that was published in a 2016 study that actually confirms sort of what we have thought about as the traditional roles between the public institutions, I'll call them, and private industry. So what they did here in this study is they looked at the most transformative drugs of the last 25 years, and they looked at various stages in R&D. So things like studying drug targets, disease process, mechanism and the action of the drug, preclinical studies, formulation, manufacturing techniques. And they took that whole series of events and they broke it into 4 categories. for these most transformative drugs over the last 25 years. And what they found actually confirms what we tend to think. So as you'll see, the basic research is dominated by the public sector, and then the latter three phases are dominated by the private sector industry. But I will note that, you don't see any of these as 100%. So certainly there is some crossover between who's doing what. So I thought next what might be useful is to sort of map this onto what we think of as the drug discovery process through FDA approval. So this is taken from a bioindustry analysis and also a tough study that was conducted looking at average times and expenditures to get a drug from hypothesis or discovery all the way through FDA approval. And so what you have here on the left vertical is basically the pre-human stage. So you might have the hypothesis and then say it's, okay, this is the drug target that we need to focus on to solve this disease. Then you go through a process of maybe identifying thousands of molecules that you think may be worth looking into. You go through in vitro screening, so putting it in a petri dish and seeing if it has the action that you'd like, and also animal testing to see, is this working in animals? Are these viable candidates? And through that process, which takes about 3 to 5 years, you're going to get from thousands of molecules down to only 10 molecules. So after that point, when you have your 10 molecules through your FDA approval, you only have about a 10% chance of success. And that's because you're moving into human testing. So you have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 testing, and you can see numbers here representing on average how many molecules fall out at each of those stages. And phase 1 is small study, phase 2 is a little bit large, and phase 3 is your really large studies. And then at the end of the day, you're just going to have maybe on average one of those 10 molecules make it through FDA approval such that it can be delivered to patients. So overall, this whole process takes about 10 to 15 years, and on average, it's about 1.4 billion of out-of-pocket expenses. So you might ask, why am I talking about this? Well, I think it helps us understand the different roles of the players we were looking at in that biopharma ecosystem I put up. So where the universities and public institutions come in is they're really that top left portion of this. So the hypothesis may be identifying thousands of potential molecules to be screened. But after that, that's where university comes in. That's where industry comes in through the licensing that has been described today. And why that's important and why I think it's useful to illustrate it this way is you see the increase in risk and failure as you move along. And with every failure, there's a loss of money. And so what we do is we think of, okay, the best way for public money to be used is to fund these initial discoveries, the initial hypothesis, and license it out to industry, right? So the universities and public institutions will get a return through licensing, which I believe Joe talked about, and Steve. These are not insignificant sums of money. But then after that point, it's really industry that steps in and takes the risk and really experiences a lot of the failure. And the reason why that's important is because typically we don't accept that that's a good use of public funds when you're having 90% failure rates, for example. But if we didn't have systems like the Bayh-Dole system, that actually is probably what these universities and public institutions would have to take on, because as was discussed earlier, Bayh-Dole and the patent rights that are associated through Bayh-Dole are really what facilitate the ability of industry to step in, to want to take these risks, to be incentivized to expend the additional money it takes to get through FDA approval. So I guess in conclusion, from an industry perspective, we find that the Bayh-Dole Act has been incredibly important in maintaining the biopharma ecosystem and has really been a useful part in facilitating drug approvals. We've heard about 200 or over 200 drugs have been approved through this system, and so we're happy that the Bayh-Dole system exists, and we don't want it to change. Thank you.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much, Joe, Steve, and Melissa. As I indicated, we are expecting Representative Collins at 1 o'clock to provide some remarks. as that's in about 5 minutes, I thought we'd take a few minutes for panel Q&A, and then when the representative arrives, we'll let him speak, and then once he's done, we'll open it up to some audience Q&A. So, you know, there's been a lot of conversation in Washington and today on the topic of, you know, what the intent of Bayh-Dole Act march-in rights are. You know, Joe, you were there at the beginning. What was Congress really trying to do when they implemented march-in rights to the Bayh-Dole Act?
Okay, well, when you're actually looking at, you have to think of the context. Bayh-Dole was written, can you hear me okay? Bayh-Dole was written in 1978. So when you're looking at the legislative intent, those of you who are working in Congress, you can only deal with what you know at that point. At that point in time, we were looking at, the thrust of Bayh-Dole was to make sure that technology is being developed. The debate during Bayh-Dole, and it really was a bitter debate, a lot of people thought that it was immoral for people to have patents on things with public funding, that we really should be put in the public domain. There's still people that think that. And again, that's nothing wrong with thinking that. The problem is they're not commercialized. We've actually had the record. We've run the experiment. The other thing was, who should own the technology? Should it be managed by the government or by universities or people making the inventions? That was a real, those are the real debates during Bayh-Dole. And we thought very strongly that that technologies has to be managed by the people creating them. But the other thing that Congress wanted to make sure of was that there are legitimate efforts are being made to actually take the technology to market. Now, that didn't start with Bayh-Dole. In 1945, when World War II was winding down, President Roosevelt had Vannevar Bush look at, before World War II, the government did not fund a lot of research. We won World War II, not just militarily, but also scientifically. We built up the world's greatest research engine. And President Roosevelt said, you know, one of the big fears was after World War I, we went into the Depression. So Roosevelt's thing, okay, what should we do with this infrastructure? And Vannevar Bush came back with a study called Science, the Endless Frontier. And that was the basis of the National Science Foundation. That was the basis for NIH funding basic research. That was a huge change in the government. So President Roosevelt dies. As soon as they start doing this, then inventions started being made. Now, again, the presumption was anything that the government funds can be put in the public domain. But almost immediately they saw, well, that doesn't always work. So President Truman had his Attorney General look at it, and the Attorney General in 1947 came back and said that under the circumstances when the contractor owns an invention, if they don't develop it, in other words, commercialize it, the government can offer it for licenses on reasonable royalty rates. Now remember that term reasonable, okay? Royalty rates. 1963, again, the presumption is the government's going to take it. Well, it became clear as time went by that wasn't always working. So in 1963, President Kennedy has a presidential memorandum. And he built on what Truman had said. And Kennedy's memorandum said if the contractor, meaning who's making it, who gets the invention, has not brought it to practical application, in other words, commercialization, then the government can force him to license it to other people on reasonable terms. Remember these words are going to come back later in Bayh-Dole. 1971, President Nixon looks at the whole thing again, decides to make it a little bit easier for contractors to own it, and again reinforces that if the contractor is not commercializing it, the government can force it to be licensed to other people on reasonable terms, okay? So when we were passing by, oh, I'm sorry, we got the congressman here. No, I don't think so. Well,
Finish your thought there. And we'll,
okay. So basically, when we were passing Bayh-Dole, we were building on what people had done before. And so there's 4 triggers under Bayh-Dole where the government can actually force the university to license other people. What we're debating is the first trigger. The first trigger says the actions necessary is a contractor or assignee. Now, under Bayh-Dole, a contractor is the university, okay? If they have not taken or expect to take with a reasonable time effective steps to achieve practical application, having somebody commercialize it, the government can then force them to license somebody else. What does that mean? The university does not commercialize products. What we're talking about is the terms of the licensing agreement. Are they trying to license it? Are they making good faith efforts to license it? If they have licensed it, are the terms conducive to commercialization? Under that also means, are you actually monitoring the license? Are you making sure people are actually trying to develop it? That's what march-in rights means under that term. There's 3 other triggers which actually apply also to the university and the person developing it. Are you making enough product to satisfy a health or safety need? Can you satisfy regulation? Or if the company got a license saying they're going to make it domestically, if they violated that, the government can march in. That's what margin rights means. It's never meant the government can control prices. It's always meant that the government can make sure that legitimate efforts are being made to take a technology to market. And with that, I'll defer to the congressman.
Great, thanks, Joe. All right, and we're delighted that Representative Doug Collins can join us this morning. Representative Collins represents Georgia's 9th congressional district, which he's done since 2013. Representative Collins is the ranking member on the House Judiciary Committee. Before he joined Congress, Representative Collins served in Georgia's state legislature and established his own legal practice. He is a U.S. Air Force Reserve chaplain and is still active as a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force Reserve. Thank you very much, Representative Collins, for agreeing to be with us this morning.
Hi, everybody. How are y'all? I don't like podiums. So, I get stuck, and when I'm going between 16 different things, I have people in my ear all the time. How are y'all today? Good. Good? Well, I like that. I got help up front here. Everybody else, how are they today?
Good.
And now we're talking to the camera. Everything changes now. It is good to be here. I've been traveling around today. When in hearing that discussion, in the discussion on what the actual product, how we get it to commercialization, and we think about, and it was just talking about the discussion on comparison of notes is how the commercialization, especially some of the universities, especially when actually made into commercialized and actually monetized, when you get that, you're looking at about a Bryce Harper contract. So that's pretty good, when you think about this as you go forward. But I want to do a couple of things. One, we know the advantage of this law. We know what it has actually done and how it is encouraged, and especially in my home state of Georgia, with Georgia Tech, Emory, the many things that have come out of there, and all across the country. What I want to emphasize the most, though, is what I think gets lost in these discussions, and I talk about this all the time, is this fact of innovation and how we need to cultivate more of it. Basically, the country needs to understand why this matters. We understand the commercialization, we understand what happens at the end, but sometimes thinking for thinking's sake is a good idea, even in Washington, D.C. Some of you will catch up on the way home. Thinking for thinking's sake, thinking for thinking, researching for researching's sake. Because how many times have any of us started off with one idea, started our research, started a hypothesis, and by the time we got to the end, we said, well, that was a crazy thought at the beginning, but I've got something even better. When we have this kind of a system to do this is what it gets exciting about. This is what drives me to come talk about this and encourage you to do the same thing, to take the things that we've actually done well in this Bayh-Dole and other things like this that give the subsidies with NIH and the helping of research universities, but to keep those patents that are actually there within their research ability. This is the kind of thing that makes us stand out in the world. And if we lose that, and I'm telling you, there is a possibility up here of a lack of understanding on Capitol Hill and among members of Congress who do not understand the value of a patent system, who do not value of a copyright or trademark or trade secret or any of these things as we go forward. I need your help on a bigger level. Go research all you want, commercialize all you want, but you got to realize that sometimes you're going to have to help us and folks like myself to actually come up here and actually educate legislators who some have actually said that our patent system is government-controlled monopolies. Think about this. These are the same people also who carry on pocket constitutions. Undoubtedly, they have trouble comprehending what they're reading. That's not what it says. It says if you protect the content, you have the patents, you have the university systems, you have those thinkers out there. When you protect that, what follows protection? Incentive. Incentive follows the protection because then there's something worth investing in. And at the end of the day, whether you're a research scientist or a venture capitalist, you all understand return on investment. And that is the kind of thing that this law has done such a great job of doing, and you were doing a great job explaining how we get to that point. So sometimes I like to break it down even simpler than just the law is. Understand that thoughts are the very essence of who we are. It's what makes us different. It gives us that thing to, as the old saying goes, what is around the next corner? What is around the next, why do we discover, why do we go on adventures? Is because it's just sort of what we need to do. It's what gives us that opportunity to find new results. And if we simply stay in our own lanes, then the scenery really is not going to change. This is why this is so important, why I'm glad y'all are having this discussion today and we can continue this process, and I'm glad you let me drop in the middle of it between everything else. And it's a much bigger break to coming down here to see folks who are thinking, looking ahead to the future, than sometimes arguing the moment. The moment is great. We all have to live in it. But that moment just passed. We're now living in the next moment. and protecting those thoughts and innovations are why we're here and what we do and what we do. So I just want to say thank you for what you're doing. You got a friend here. I need you to help me continue to educate as well. But thank y'all and God bless you. Appreciate it.
Question. You gotta run. You gotta run. No worries. Thank you so much.
I can't take questions, even on the camera. I appreciate it. Send them
Thank
to
you
me.
so
If
much.
you want to call my office, we'll be happy to do that.
That's good. Thank you.
Good job.
All right.
It's
Well,
got to be a
fantastic.
fun guy to work for.
Did you want to amplify anything from?
Yeah. So one of the points that Joe made was that of practical application with the Bayh-Dole Act. And I want to just kind of put us in a time machine and go back to 1980. 1980, there were very few technology transfer offices that existed in the U.S. There was just no need for a tech transfer office because prior to Bayh-Dole, inventions that were funded in part or in whole by the federal government were owned by the federal government. Federal government was responsible for commercializing those inventions. So there was really no significant tech transfer organization at the time. So this phrase that Joe mentions and has now been twisted a little bit of practical application revolved around the fear of the drafters that a newer tech transfer office would not know exactly how to best amplify those inventions. And I'll give an example. One of the oddest tech transfer conversations I was ever involved in was when I was at a university. We had a great technology. I had identified a company that made a competing product. And so I reached out to them. I said, well, hey, our product, once developed into a product, is likely going to be 4 times better than what you have. They were very interested. I said, great, this is exactly what I wanted to do. We talked about financial terms, we talked about other terms, and interestingly, they had no concerns on the financial front. We talked about royalties, and they didn't really care about any royalties. I said, okay, great, we'll move this forward. And as we're working on the terms, I said, and of course, this is a federally funded invention, so I am going to expect that you move this to the marketplace. And so I started adding clauses in there related to, well, by such and such date, we'll provide this to the FDA. By such and such date, they'll be on the market. And all of a sudden, they freaked out. No. How about we just pay you more up front? We don't need to have those. And the more I got into it, what were they doing? They wanted to take that technology that was a competitor to theirs. They wanted to license it that was funded by our money. And then they wanted to stick it on the shelf and just leave it there, and then let their product continue. That was the fear of practical application. That is an example, had we gone through with that, that is not practical application. That is actually burying it. So I want to provide some context for why we did that, and again, the context of it was somewhat junior tech transfer professionals back then. We've come a really long way. As my colleagues in the room know, diligence provisions, which is the provisions I was talking about, are standard in contracts now to protect the intellectual property that we've helped fund. I just want to make that point.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Okay. Let's now open it to the floor for questions from the audience. If you would please state your name and the organization that you're with. Thank you.
Brian Lozier with Representative Shimkus. I just have a question kind of about, I think, the basic legislative process here. I know the marching rights and drug prices are kind of the context. But, you know, when I work with universities, I don't really hear them ever talk about this. You know, it seems like you're illustrating this, you know, mutually beneficial framework, and I'm not questioning that at all, but I always have a difficult time, I think, extracting from manufacturers sort of the genesis of maybe the basic research. I know it's really complicated, but you know, you do have folks, I think, on the Senate side that are interested in sort of a name tag type policy where a drug manufacturer would need to indicate kind of where the ingredients of this final product came from. But you know, is that something that you notice from the university sector, that they have a hard time translating that on Capitol Hill? Because you know, it seems to me like there would be a much more receptive audience, at least from a member standpoint, if you know we were hearing on Monday our university just licensed. I know Northwestern and Lyrica is another sort of anecdotal experiment, but example. But you know, you're talking about at $34 billion a year at NIH of $2.7 million per invention. I mean, we're talking like 1,200 or 1,300 a year. I mean, maybe I can stop there, but does that? maybe I'm the only one that has that frustration, but I think it's been a difficult sort of code to break.
Right.
Go ahead, Steve.
I think what I hear you saying is you'd like to see examples of successes. And so within Autumn, I'm going to make a little pitch to two things that we provide. So number one, Autumn Better World Project. Google that, which, as you pointed out, is a Stanford startup. So Better World Project is actually a collection of over 500 stories that are academic tech transfer success stories. They can actually be sorted by state, by country. And so it might be very effective to actually go through and see some of the success stories of those. The second resource I wanted to make you aware of is we have what we call the Autumn Innovation Marketplace. It's a collection of over 20,000 technologies that are available for licensing. So again, you got a continuum here, right? So you got early stage inventions that are looking for partners. Then you've got those technologies that are in the hands of partners, and then you've got the actual products at the end. Better World Projects, the projects at the end. The projects at the beginning are in this Autumn Innovation Marketplace. So just by scrolling through that again, and you could look at it by university, by state, you can actually see the different technologies that are being developed with our federal funds. Does that help answer your question?
I think what you're saying is right on target, because one thing I urge universities to do all the time is don't take this for granted. And I think a lot of us tend to wait till a catastrophe's at the door. And I always say, look, go in there, explain to people what you're doing, because the reason we have Bayh-Dole is Purdue came to see us one day. We didn't know what they wanted. But when Purdue came to Birch Bayh's office, they came right to the front. Now, that's the reason we have Bayh-Dole. And I think, it's really important, as you all know, to get in there before a crisis is there, because what I would like to do is make sure when an issue comes up related to this, you're calling back to the university saying, hey, what happens if we do that? It's too late when your boss has signed on to something and suddenly the university's in and say, oh my God, you just, kicked the bottom out of our startup engine. So unfortunately, I really wish we'd get in there before the crisis hits and not wait till later. And then you're getting people like you trying to say, geez, I wish you'd been in here 6 months ago.
Also, there's a source of information on the NIH homepage. I'm Mark Rohrbaugh from the NIH. And there are stories of product development that go back usually 40 years or more to describe the very basic research and the various contributions of both private sector and public sector. For example, with Gleevec, it started with some basic research understanding chromosomes and their role in cancer.
I should also add that our report goes in and looks at the functions of several NIH offices in particular, like NCATS, like the SBIRS DTR program and funding the technology transfer and commercialization. We received a question from Patrick Michaels from Senator Cornyn's office. He couldn't be here today, but he asked if I would pose a question to the panel going as the following. With the realization of increased economic espionage from some foreign countries like China, how can we best protect intellectual property and critical research funded by the American taxpayer while also incentivizing competition within the marketplace?
Well, I have two thoughts on this, and maybe it's not a comprehensive answer, but first I would say there are provisions in the Patent Act that are intended to prevent entities abroad practicing U.S. patents and then the end results of those processes coming back into the U.S. It's, I believe, 271G. But unfortunately, I think we hinted at a little bit that the patent system may be under threat a little bit. So provisions like that actually, it's not clear that they're being enforced as much as they should be these days. So one thing I would say is that we need to really look at the reason that provisions like that are intended to prevent this type of activity from happening. We need to make sure they're enforced with the intent that they were designed with. And then the other thing I would say is, especially in my field, and obviously Bayh-Dole applies to all fields of technology, but we do know that the manufacture of drug products is getting more complicated. So especially if you think of large molecule drugs like biological products, those are a lot more difficult and they require a lot of skilled labor to produce. And one thing we know, and I think it was touched upon today, is because of the success of Bayh-Dole and our patent system here over the last several decades, we have incredibly high-skilled laborers in our in the biological field. They are well-educated, well-paid, and really talented people. And because of these systems, we're able to have this workforce here. And so by maintaining these systems that incentivize and result in these skilled laborers that are required to produce these technologies, hopefully it will keep a lot of that here and not going to abroad.
I think one other point to add there is that if you look at federal funding for research and development as a share of U.S. GDP, it's actually now at its lowest point since 1962. We'd have to invest about $80 billion more a year to catch up to where we were as a share of GDP back in 1962. And you see this in the life sciences. Back in the 60s, about 60% of NIH R01 research grants were approved. Today that number's somewhere in the 20s, low 20s. Last I looked, the average age of first R01 grant had increased from 34 to 42. There's less money. That can support really valuable research efforts. And if we're not adequately funding our life sciences researchers, then in an environment of increasing global competition, and we've seen this, we've seen researchers go to China, go to Singapore, because we're not providing an environment where they can succeed. And it goes back to the point that you made, Steve and Joe, that we cannot rest on our laurels. We cannot assume that U.S. leadership in life sciences is something we can take for granted. We have to continue to invest in policies and research to keep us in lead. Please.
Hi, Chelsea Dixon with the British Embassy. Kind of on your point, Stephen, what's the future if investing from the federal government is going down? Do you think that industry is going to start putting more money into it? Do you think this $100 to $1 balance will stay, or if it'll change?
Go ahead.
So again, with our autumn licensing survey, we've been tracking that data for years, and we've seen that dipping of the percentage of federal funds. So federal funds are increasing, but all funds are increasing. It's just not increasing the same level. What we've not seen is industry picking up. So industry has been relatively flat at 8% for a decade. It really has not increased. So that means as federal funding's decreasing, industry funding staying the same. So now you've got 58% plus 8%, you get 66%. 1/3 of all research funding is coming from foundations, from internal research at the university. So we're not actually seeing industries picking up that decrease.
I was actually in the UK last week and met with your Minister of Education. So all of us are comparing best models, and they're actually looking at the American model, and we're obviously looking at what they're doing in Cambridge, which was founded in 1208, which is pretty amazing to me. The gentleman behind there has been trying to ask a question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but just to finish a response to that, and it goes back to the point of the really strong complementarity between public and private investment in life sciences in the U.S. For instance, Everett Ehrlich has found that for every dollar of NIH support for research, it leads to an additional increase of private medical research of roughly 32 cents. And the Milken Institute has found that every $1 of NIH funding has boosted the size of the U.S. bioscience industry by as much as $170 to $320 for every federal dollar spent. So it's a clear complementarity, and we really can't expect that we would have one without the other at the robust levels we've had in the past. Go ahead.
Luis with Knowledge Ecology International, which it's cited by the report, published, I guess, has a background to this event. And I want to go back to the idea that the Bayh-Dole Act and the marching rights and other safeguards only relate to non-use or practical application of the invention. And I want to cite Section 200 of the Bayh-Dole Act, which sets the policy objectives of the legislation. And he says, among other things, that the Bayh-Dole Act's objective is to protect the public against non-use or unreasonable use of the invention. And so non-use relates to practical application, but there's the or, suggesting that there's something else which is reasonable use. And so I want to ask, what do you guys understand by that phrase? If it's not high prices, what do you guys understand that phrase reasonable use to mean?
I think if you look at the context of the time, people were really concerned that folks might be actually trying to grab a technology to suppress it. So there really wasn't a bunch of debate about what we meant by unreasonable use. But back to the particular thing, we're really talking about marching rights. You have to look at that particular section. And there've been a number of petitions filed by your group, which was fine. All of them have been dismissed by every administration. In fact, the Obama administration actually dismissed more of them because they've looked at the law and they said that it clearly doesn't mean to control drug prices or any prices. That never came up in the legislation. It was never intended. In fact, that whole interpretation came up 20 years after we passed the law. So you can't just pick one little word, which is fine, and then go back and try to say that's how the whole construction looked. And it's not just my word for it. It's actually NIH under the last two administrations have looked at that and rejected it and saying, look, Bayh-Dole is not meant to control prices. The final thing is Bayh-Dole can't be a way of trying to regulate drug prices. It's just not going to work. We've run that experiment, and again, you actually look at the data which Stephen had up there. I pay I'm going to get in my personal life. Drugs are expensive, but to try to say that when you're licensing a drug, that anybody can tell you what a reasonable price is going to be 15 years down the road is insane. In fact, I'll ask Melissa. I mean, what would happen if, in fact, you were trying to sign a license, and there's a clause in there which is, again, reasonable pricing is not defined in Bayh-Dole. Bayh and Dole both came back when that thing was cited, saying, if you want to do that, there's a mechanism for changing the law. It's not to go through all the one little word here and say, therefore the whole law meant to do that. There's a process, and you know what the process is? We're on Capitol Hill. The legislative branch, if you don't like what the law says, you don't go back and try to turn it on its head by some wordsmithing. You actually amend the law. And if you're going to amend the law, you have to do this. You have to define what a reasonable price means right up front. So if a company's coming to negotiate and you're going to say, okay, you have to do this at a reasonable price, then there should be some statutory definition. Now, good luck doing that. But again, if folks want to do that, we're in America. It's a democracy. You've got people on Hill that are perfectly capable legislators. You have to change the law in the process. You can't come back 20 years later and say, this is what they should have meant, because clearly we didn't mean that at the time. Now, you can fault us for not doing that, okay? We weren't looking to control drug prices. We were trying to make sure that things were commercialized. And the final thing I'll add is, one of the big impetuses was the first press conference we ever had from Bayh-Dole was we had, I think, about 20 drugs or 20 healthcare things were actually held up at NIH. They were going to benefit no one. Senator Bayh's wife, I didn't know this, had breast cancer, and she was at NIH getting treatments. And he was adamant, he never said this to me, he said it later, that if there's any potential cure, he wants to make sure it's actually out there where people can use. But it wasn't, again, you can't control drug prices through a tech transfer law. And again, if you look at the statute, if you look at the marching rights, it's really clear what it means. And again, it's not Joe Allen saying this, it's every past administration, as Republican and Democratic, including the Obama administration, has rejected that interpretation. It was just rejected by NIST. So again, you don't have to take my word for it, and I don't want to get into wordsmithing debate, but if you want to change the law, then do that. And also, if you're going to change the law, it's on you if, in fact, you kill this whole system. It's on you, because we've run that experiment before. People are free to do it, but if you want to change the process and go through the process, you can't just pick up a word here and there and say, therefore you meant to do something. Final thing I'll say is, if you're writing legislation, it's not the daggone Da Vinci Code. We don't bury meetings and have people go through some secret code to figure out what we meant. We said what we meant, and we did not mean to control drug prices. Could I be more blunt?
Just to add on to what Joe said, like I was showing up there, right, it's a 10 to 15 year process, $1.4 billion on average out-of-pocket cost. That money has to come from somewhere. People can invest in other things. Venture capitalists, for example, we do see a shift of them into high technology, right? So apps and things like that, where, it takes 1 to 2 years to get a product on the market. And so if you start throwing uncertainty into that 10 to 15 year process by saying, if at the end of this, we might just take your rights away, or maybe you just won't have a patent anymore, that makes the investment a lot less good looking. People aren't going to want to invest as much. And that goes to, I think, what Joe is saying as well. You can't flip the system around, right? It takes a long time to get these drugs and cures to market. And that's what's most important here, and it requires, unfortunately, or fortunately, a lot of investment and time along the way.
I'd like to add a little to this conversation. My name is John Fraser. I was head of the tech transfer office at Florida State University, where the technology that was licensed to Bristol Myers Squibb to manufacture the drug Taxol was actually invented. When I joined FSU, the license was already in place. And I had a question in my mind, which was, how much is the patient who is faced with breast or ovarian cancer paying for this drug? And how much of that depended on the royalty that came to our institution? Was that royalty preventing the use of the drug? Yes or no? So I went to Bristol and asked the question. I got the answer back 2 months later. And here's the answer. And it's highly relevant to this conversation. We licensed to Bristol, who then bottled it, had received FDA approval, and sold it to a big drug wholesaler. That's where our royalty was, right there in that sale. That wholesaler then sold it to hospital buying groups with another markup. And then the drug hospital buying groups sold it to individual hospitals, marking it up again. And then the hospital sold it to the patients, marking it up one more time. Okay? Along the way, of course, there's subsidizations, grant backs, and a variety of things that are not particularly transparent. But the answer from Bristol to my question was the following. In 2008, one course of Taxol infused into the human body the patient was charged roughly $600 for that one course. And if you were a patient, you had multiple courses over at least 3 weeks, and then you came back again. Of the $600, the royalty that came to Florida State University amounted to 1/2 of 1 penny on the $600. I was flabbergasted. But it was explained to me this was the distribution system in the American healthcare system for this one drug.
That's great.
Okay.
Great. So let's take one final question, which I saw, and then we'll wrap it up because we're.
So my
past our
point
10:30.
basically is the following. You want to control drug prices, the royalties paid to the university are irrelevant.
I saw one last question. Possibly. Val?
Well, I was going to ask. I'm Val Molazan from Astellas Pharmaceuticals. Thank you. Really enjoyed hearing from you all. I was just going to ask a little bit more about the royalties and how those work, because you hear often the complaint that on the Democratic side that the taxpayer is paying for a drug twice because they paid during the investment and now they're having to pay again. And so, just trying to better understand what it is the universities get out of this. And are there any good little links for seeing that type of information?
Well, I don't have particular numbers. The one number I do know off the top of my head is not to universities, but I think it was between 2011 and 2018, the royalties paid back to the NIH, CDC, and maybe one other entity, but life sciences related, was about $1 billion over that period of time. And so I don't know, maybe Steve or somebody might have more specific information on the amount of money that's being given back. But part of why I did illustrate the long pathway that was going through is like, I understand the arguments made that the public is paying twice, but I think that doesn't really look at the entirety of the system and the investment that's made by industry, which I think a number was shown earlier on one of Stephen's slides, which is $90 billion, I think, roughly a year by the industry, which, and I know that there's another study, too, that suggests that if you only look at approved drugs, the NIH budget would have to increase by about 2.5 times. So it's currently about $35 billion, I think, to handle just the approved drug process for if it were to replace industry. So, but you might have some better.
I think, I'm sorry, one rule of thumb is a university or federal invention is more like an idea than a product.
Yeah.
So it's not something you're going to go out and sell. In fact, Mark is here from NIH. Sometimes NIH will say, look, this is so important that we need to take it further down the pipeline to try to attract an industry sponsor. Even when they do that, they have a hard time finding even one licensee. So this is not a slam dunk giveaway to industry, because there's always, the reason they're taking it further down the pipeline is because there's a small market, there's a lot of risk out there. So if you look at our system, the government is funding some upfront money, and again, sometimes be significant, but in the totality of actually taking a drug to market, it's a small percentage. And again, if it fails, it's companies like yours that take the hit. No one at NIH loses their job. People in the private sector actually lose their jobs. I was just looking at this morning at a small biotech which had a phase 3 drug that crashed, and their stock market just took a hit. There are real life consequences there. So the public is not paying twice for drugs. There's a reason why most drugs are made in the United States, as Stephen said, because we incentivize the risk, but the risk is being taken by the private sector. And again, if you look at where NIH takes, like NCATS, which is their new institute, it's saying these are particular disease markets which we have to put some additional federal funding in to try to coax a private partner out there. And even then, ask them how often they find multiple companies. If they find one company, they're happy.
I'd like to close with a quote from Jack Scannell, who is a senior fellow at Oxford University for the Advancement of Sustainable Medical Innovation, and then we'll wrap up. But as Jack Scannell says, I would guess that one can buy today, at rock-bottom generic prices, a set of small molecule drugs that has greater medical utility than the entire set available to anyone, anywhere, at any price in the year 1999. Nearly all that generic medicine chest of today was created by firms who invested in R&D to win future profits that they tried pretty hard to maximize. Short-term financial gain, building a long-term common good. And it's that dynamic that enables us to envision a future where biologic and small molecule drugs are available at rock-bottom generic prices in 2014 for a set of innovative drugs that have greater medical utility than the entire set available to anyone, anywhere, at any price in the year 2020. But that's only going to be the case if policymakers continue to preserve a system that supports life sciences innovation and the intellectual property rights that underpin it. Thank you all very much for being here today. The video of this event will be posted online within 24 hours. May I please ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for being with us. Thank you.